Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. The politics of scientific verification. The freedom system. Imagine that Thomas Paine busted into a session of England's Parliament and boldly announced these words from common sense: as to usurpation, no man will be so hardy to defend it, and that William the Conqueror was a usurper is a fact not to be contradicted. The plain truth is that the antiquity of English monarchy will not bear looking into. Now if Paine was right, and the proposition that the Norman conquest was usurpation is a fact, what policy implications follow from this assertion? Acceptance of the illegitimacy of the conquest puts into question not only Parliament, but the entire British political tradition. Paine's proposition was radically subversive as killing a king and abolishing the House of Lords. Like the anti-royalists who engaged in exactly this policy in 1649, Paine opined that the policy implication of William's usurpation is nothing less than democratic revolution. It should not be surprising that we can find a tradition of suppression when it comes to voices as bold as Thomas Paine. England's tradition is observable against the White Hat, a reformist, middle-class periodical of 1819. One contributor maintained that before the Norman invasion, the power of the military was in the hands of the people under elected officers. The Commons is not the British Gemot, the Council of the Anglo-Saxon Kings. It is not the representatives of the people, but the representative of an oligarchy. 1401. This is another way of saying that Harold's military government was more representative of the people than the victorious Norman military government. William defeated and overthrew the military government that embodied that more representative tradition. Yet talk of taking control of the military and putting it in the hands of the people is the stuff of revolutions. One is reminded of the New Model Army in the English Civil War. This periodical was short-lived. While government intimidation silenced these voices, they defined their notions of duty in a final departing article, to unfold the principles of the British Constitution, to point out its corruptions, and to prepare the public for the change which must take place in the present state of the country. 1402. Repression in Britain preserved the status quo and ensured that such ideas would not get out of control. Such out-of-control ideas, after all, once helped stir England into civil war. In the 1640s, freedom of speech in America helped provoke not only peaceable argument, but the violence of its own civil war. The political struggle for freedom of expression evolved as one facet of what Shelley described as a continual struggle for liberty on the part of the people, and an uninterrupted attempt at tightening the reins of oppression and encouraging ignorance and imposture by the oligarchy to whom the first William parceled out the property of the aborigines at the conquest of England by the Normans. If encouraging ignorance were an indispensable utensil in the toolbox of tyranny, then popular enlightenment would be a counter-tool in the same struggle against the Norman yoke. The American Revolution was followed by an eruption of printed matter of all forms and plans for general public educational reform. These universal antidotes to the association of tyranny and ignorance, however, can obscure the deeper wellsprings of their particular historical impetus. The influential historical essay on the English Constitution, 1771, maintained, since the conquest, our arbitrary kings, and men of arbitrary principles, have endeavored to destroy the few remaining records and historical facts that might keep in remembrance a form of government so kind, so friendly and hospitable to the human species. 1404. Here the typically Anglo-Saxon obsession with arbitrary government is specifically linked with the Norman lineage. The author accused the government of seeking destruction of the historical memory of the pre-conquest past. Although psychological repression of the defeat of Hastings was an important factor in devaluing the Norman victory, it was compounded by the interest of the conquerors in upholding their legitimacy. In short, the conquest establishment deliberately repressed memories and historical records of the pre-conquest past that called their own authority into question. One of the many rewards of conquest was the liberty to dictate the historical facts in accordance with political interests. For example, Are we to believe William of Poitiers' contemporary tale of William's coronation on Christmas Day, 1066? The English, he claimed, gave their joyful assent without hesitation, as though heaven had given them one mind and one voice. One might doubt the unanimity required by their new masters in light of an event that followed. Suddenly, he continued, the armed and mounted guards outside who had been set about the monastery, hearing the great shout in a foreign tongue, took it for some treachery and fired the neighboring houses. 1405. This event is often presented as a misinterpretation of vociferous Englishmen, the natives who spoke a foreign tongue, rather than the Norman crushing of voices who would have sided with Harold at Hastings. After all, from the Norman view, the stand of Harold and his entire army at Hastings was also an act of some treachery. Harold and his men had somehow mustered the impunity to defend their country against an invasion of these French speakers of a foreign tongue. In modern terms, one could call the aggressive arson of the Norman guards as the suppression of freedom of speech, not to mention the destruction of private property by an arbitrary and unrepresentative government. Just as pre-Darwinian thought could deem comparisons of humans with other species as absurd, it is only the legacy of pre-evolutionary thinking that confidently assures some that there is no evolutionary linkage between modern ideas and medieval actions. In William of Poitiers' tale, the subjugated could consider themselves fortunate when the Normans readily accepted the will of the English. This is an example of the Norman side of the story, the Norman propaganda, which, not coincidentally, enjoyed the support of the Norman government. The rise of the printing press and a more general increase in education among laymen stimulated a crescendo of questionings of official tales of righteous conquest. In the early 17th century, Sir Robert Cotton, a member of the Society of Antiquaries who entered Parliament in 1601, was one of those who put his scholarly labors at the disposal of the anti-royalist cause. He traced contemporary legal abuses to feudal customs dating from 1066. William the Conqueror, he wrote, left the Saxons in no better condition than villeinage. He molded their customs to the manner of his own country, and forbore to grant the laws of the Holy Edward, so often called for. 1406 The English King Edward the Confessor was evoked for his association with lost Anglo-Saxon laws. He was a symbol of the longing for the lost, pre-conquest order. Before 1640, historical scholarship of this kind was dangerous. The Society of Antiquaries was suppressed. Cotton's well-known library, which eventually formed the basis of the British Museum's manuscript collection, was searched more than once. In 1630, the government deemed its manuscripts too dangerous for free inquiry. The scholar was subsequently unable to examine them without the official tutoring of government surveillance. The politics of the past were the politics of the present. In 1627, the government threatened to prosecute the printers of Cotton's The Reign of Henry III. One of his political tracts, Proposition to Bridle Parliament, resulted in his imprisonment in 1629. The events that followed demonstrated that the government had good reason to think that it had something to hide. The renaissance of knowledge about the conquest legacy, undoctored by official tradition, was crucial to the indignant atmosphere of Anglo-Saxon national renaissance that culminated in the English Civil War. Evidence depends on records, and there is good reason to think that our picture of the late Anglo-Saxon period suffers from the loss of records. 1407 is this, at least in part, the work of a deliberate Norman destruction of the parts of the historical record. Right up until early modern times, the conquest-based establishment monopolized the interpretation and meaning of 1066. Freedom of speech evolved as a corollary of democracy, for it was an Anglo-Saxon weapon against the propaganda of the system that justified absolutism through conquest. The pen was a sword in the struggle for political representation against Big Brother propaganda that held the Norman domination good, wholesome, and right. The original de facto Norman copyright of political legitimacy also perpetuated the legitimacy of their case for the conquest. When one grasps the self-reinforcing nature of this Norman family monopoly, then one can grasp the evolution of its opposition. The American separation of the powers, the separation of church and state, and freedom of speech all evolved, in part, as means of breaking up the original sanctified monopoly represented by William the Conqueror. The very first amendment of the American Constitution prohibits Congress from abridging the freedom of speech, just as inquiry into the Norman Conquest questioned the legitimacy of hereditary British political tradition. Freedom of inquiry leads towards a questioning of the principles that formalized unfettered inquiry. If freedom of speech evolved as the expression of an internecine kinship ethnic conflict, if freedom of speech arose to legitimize questioning of the questionable legitimacy of the Norman Conquest order, this has fundamental relevance for the nature and limits of the resultant freedom of speech system. One of the most basic theses of this work is that liberal democracy's ideological inability to come to terms with socio-biological realities stems directly from resistance to coming to terms with its own socio-biological origin. This is a root reason why sociobiology is inherently controversial. Sociobiology puts freedom of speech on trial. How thoughtless and irrational to assume that old arguments for freedom of speech still hold without rethinking everything from the ground up. That I predict that attempts will be made to repress the socio-biological evidence for the Norman-Saxon origins of liberal democracy is, in part, only a continuation of the success of the original government monopoly of the interpretation of 1066 that was never completely undone. A main practical expression of the prejudice against sociobiology is the Western political individualism that formally began with Hobbes. If democratic liberalism evolved out of an internecine conflict whose net result of mutual destruction was to weaken the net import of kinship values on one hand, and strengthen individualism on the other, then liberal democracy cannot be understood on the basis of its own asserted assumptions. Liberal democracy cannot be understood on the basis of its own individualistic, political premises because these premises are explainable as a product, or resolution, of the Norman-Saxon conflict. The blind justice of individual rights and individual freedom made the Norman-Saxon conflict legally and logically invisible on the premises of its own internal, individualistic logic. The individual offered a practical strategy for evading the implications of the Norman-Saxon conflict. The individual over biological interpretation is thus a hereditary property of the liberal democratic system and a prejudice of that system. In America, individualism evolved into a further means of separating biological descent from the social present. Members of the English-speaking democracies are, in a certain way, the most prejudiced against seeing the importance of the hereditary aspects of the conquest because their modern political values evolved, in part, as a solution to the internal kinship contradictions left by the conquest. In 1969, historian R. Allen Brown wrote, "Few subjects in English history have been studied more and for longer than the Norman conquest, and few have been more bent in the process by biased interpretations based upon unhistorical prejudices. And still, after 900 years, the outcome is controversy." 1408. This, at least, most can agree with. Brown complained that, as in so many matters, the triumphant Whig view largely prevailed. The Anglo-Saxons tended to become us, the Normans them, and William the Conqueror to be cast in the role, which he is still sometimes called upon to play, of a foreign tyrant winning a regrettable victory over clean-limbed Englishmen with marked liberal and Protestant leanings. 1409. Among those who could be considered an object of Brown's complaint would be Thomas Jefferson. "It has ever appeared to me," Jefferson explained, "that the difference between the Whig and the Tory of England is, that the Whig deduces his rights from the Anglo-Saxon source, and the Tory from the Norman." 1410. The rectitude of the fight for those Anglo-Saxon rights granted warrant for insurrection in 1776. Tribalistic us and them attitudes, exactly what one would predict on the basis of kin selection, led men to risk their lives at Hastings in 1066 and in America in 1776. If it were necessary to take sides, Brown admitted, I should be with Duke William at Hastings, but in reality it should be possible to appreciate the accomplishments of the Anglo-Saxons, who are not us, without undertaking the manifest absurdity of decrying the amazing achievements of the Normans, who are not them. 141 liters. Is there no end to this blood feud? 1412. Strange that Brown should be so willing to take the pro-Norman side, yet assure his readers of the unreality of the tribal mind. If Brown were alive at the time of the conquest, would he really have had the luxury of choosing sides? In 1066, Brown's kin relationships would have been directly related to his eligibility for spoils of the Norman victory. If this extraordinary race of men 1413 achieved a victory, it was, by definition, a defeat of the Anglo-Saxon race. Why might many descendants of the latter call into question the nature of that achievement? But how can one gain objectivity? Brown implied that despite his pro-Norman bias, he could gain an objective perspective on the achievements of the Normans that was above the traditional tribalisms. Perhaps a higher, more objective perspective might be achieved by training the conflict of kinship, biological, or tribal factors. Yet if the very biological existence of a human being is explainable in Darwinistic terms through success in tending to genetic relations, then the very possibility of objectivity implies overcoming oneself in the most existential, biological sense. If debate on the Norman conquest engenders passionate convictions, and the only way to obtain objective calmness on a public level is to drain arguments of biological factors, is not this peculiar form of objectivity really a form of subjectivity in regard to objective biological factors? That prejudice consists of bias towards biological factors, rather than bias against biological factors, is itself a prejudice partly traceable to Anglo-Saxon biological factors in the creation of the liberal democratic system. Hereditary hostility against hereditary government became the socio-biological inheritance of America. Anglo-Saxon ethnic prejudice against the Norman conquerors is literally built into the nature of the American system. The American prejudice towards equality is a gloss over an original Anglo-Saxon prejudice against the Norman master race. Hostility to this very socio-biological interpretation should be the most normal expectation, for it is only a continuation of the enlightened ethnic cleansing that has disinherited the import of Norman influence. A socio-biological theory that proposes that the Normans were a decisive influence on innovations that were designed to achieve freedom from that influence is congenitally uncongenial. To ask why sociobiology is controversial within liberal democracy is like asking why the English disassociate their traditional class system from a caste system. Class, especially as interpreted by Marx, de-emphasizes the biological thinking that emphasized the idea of two nations, or a caste system. Class, in the Marxist sense, removes the biological factors that sociobiology synthesizes. The English word class helped preserve elements of caste by dominating the interpretation of the difference and thus diffusing the potential source of class conflict. The idea that the early distinction between commons and lords was a polite way of referring to Anglo-Saxons and Normans can only be held as a generalization. Yet in the avoidance of such generalizations, in upholding the Old English political taboo of speaking of Normans and Saxons, we can see the ancestor of the trends that eventually matured and blossomed into all the diversities of political correctness. Any expectation of freedom of speech on this subject should take at its starting point recognition that, for the sake of tradition and cultural identity, the English continued to be strongly invested in upholding this taboo. The same bias against biological factors that prevents one from seeing a Norman-Saxon conflict as the evolutionary basis of the liberal constitutional state evolved, by implication, into a bias against discerning the evolutionary significance of biology and race. It would be ridiculous to think that a stable, viable American social system that has any pretension to some form of democracy could tolerate anything but the assumption of equality. Only egalitarian assumptions tend to survive into the public discussions of a nation whose uniqueness consists of inordinate diversity, difference, unequalness. Equality united, from the very beginning, unequalness. After allowing these ideas of freedom and equality to unfold for well over 200 years, Americans have a vested interest in this prestigious pedigree of egalitarianism. They are politically invested in at least some version of low-key nurturism, and thus politically invested in the proposition of the fallaciousness of many findings of the science of sociobiology. In consequence, Americans are least free to consider the accuracy of sociobiology in a way that the American founders, at their best, considered the human science of their day. Americans, rather, are the most biased against understanding the evolutionary link between the conquest and the American Revolution. Americans are the most biased because they are living the implications of Anglo-Saxon revulsion towards an unsavory past. Americans are the most prejudiced towards equality because they possess the greatest vested interest in the political egalitarian status quo of this form of invested prejudice against racism and sexism. Americans are perhaps the most prejudiced people on earth. The controversy over sociobiology and liberal democracies is not a novelty, and it will fade away, or be absorbed with progress. There will never be a time when the full implications of prescriptive genetic adaptation will be considered digestible and reconcilable with the basic assumptions and principles of liberal democracy. The prejudice against the evidence for sociobiology is built into the basic architecture of the liberal democratic system. Any political system has its holes or blind spots, and so long as this particular political system maintains itself, sociobiology will remain controversial within it. Chapter break. Which way to? The backwards idea of progress. Back to main text. The American political system was built upon pre-Darwinian human science. The notion of democratic progress is also pre-Darwinian. It's the 21st century already. Why are we still upholding these backwards notions of progress? Americans have never really gotten over the 19th century. The will to rule over other nations and extend its notions of a liberal progress is like a nostalgic will to live in that past. Progress, it seems, means that this concept's original, humanistic value assumptions become eternalized and live forever. The modern notion, a parallel between scientific progress and egalitarian moral progress, is historically bound. There can be no end of history if there is no end to scientific discoveries and technological inventions. Enlightenment founders were not, and could not, have been enlightened about the subsequent discovery of evolution by natural selection. The idea of human equality is really the product of an inequality in the growth of scientific knowledge. The physical sciences that strongly influenced the political enlightenment developed before the biological discoveries that culminated in Darwin's theories. The principle of human equality is thus partly a reflection of the primitive state of biological knowledge in the late 18th century. In retrospect, it seems that the goodness of the biological sciences, from a traditional liberal point of view, was directly related to the primitivity of its development. For example, before Darwin and sociobiology, one could reasonably claim that a person who denied the theory of the equality of man was ignorant. Now someone who denies the reality of biological differences may themselves be ignorant of the new discoveries of sociobiological science. The best that can be said of the original liberal theory of the natural equality of man is that it was a pseudoscience. As Francis Fukuyama has pointed out, there is no necessary correlation between politically incorrect findings and bad science. Attacking the methodological credentials of people whose views one doesn't like and dismissing their work as pseudoscience is a convenient shortcut around arguing over substance. 1414. In this case, dismissing sociobiology as pseudoscience exposes how sociobiology has refuted the original theory of human nature that underlies liberal democracy. The problem, it seems, is not that sociobiology does not make sense. The problem is that sociobiology makes too much sense. Sociobiology is an outlaw science precisely because of its strengths as a science. One could say that anti-sociobiologists must call it pseudoscience, preempting rational discussion, because sociobiology pulls the intellectual foundation of the old liberal arguments from beneath their feet. Every nation has its founding myth. Presumptions of superiority to biology and its egalitarian corollaries are among the basic myths of America. Bolstered by a priori religious and moral faith, the script for the unfolding of human equality was set in stone from the beginning, so that even discoveries that radically refute the idea could not break the egalitarian faith. While many aspects of the liberal humanism may have begun closer to science than religion, The chasm between what is empirically known about human variation and its egalitarian assumptions resembles the chasm between science and other religions. Science and reason were once thought necessary to weaken false political beliefs. It turns out that scientific discoveries such as those underlying human sociobiology must be repressed in order to uphold belief in the egalitarian ideas of the Enlightenment. Should scientific knowledge be suppressed for the sake of enlightened values? The situation is illustrated by the United Nations, which is only a further universalization of the principles of liberal democracy. Let us just imagine if the truth or falsity of theories of sociobiology, especially those relevant to race issues among humans, are to be decided by democratic majority at the United Nations. Would the truth or falsity of one of those theories be determined by politics or scientific validity? Sociobiology, by refuting the pre-Darwinian formulas of human nature that liberal democracy is premised up, is empirical evidence that the modern idea of progress is a delusion. Kin selection is especially devastating for the idea of progress in that it posits a rational, biological basis for nepotistic behavior. But wait, one of the reasons that kin selection is inherently controversial in Western liberal democracies is because of the latent cultural influence of Christianity. A scientific understanding of Christianity in light of kin selection helps demonstrate how Christian family values work in diametrical opposition to kin selection. For some reason, the values distinctive to the Bible, as opposed to paganism, point in a direction opposite of the values that a sociobiologist would consider genetically adaptive. This helps to explain the faith underlying American egalitarianism. From a purely biological perspective, progress in the egalitarian sense appears to be a backwards idea, but just as the science of sociobiology demonstrates evidence that contradicts progress from the perspective of biological evolution, the science behind the positing of a technological singularity may revive the idea of progress from the perspective of post-biological evolution. Yet the singularity's redemption of the notion of progress will likely prove even more controversial than sociobiology. Ignorance of the insights furnished by sociobiology help cultivate ignorance of what it would truly mean to fulfillment of the idea that nurture overcomes nature. The liberal democracies are racing directly down the path of genetic suicide, taking nearly the most efficient path to an evolutionary transition that will lead to massive unemployment and, over the long run, the extinction of the biological human race. Is this smart? Yet who could say this is development would not be justified when biological humanity is demonstrating the inferiority of its comprehension of its own biological identity through the repression of socio-biological self-knowledge. The extinction of the biological human race by artificially intelligent machines is the logical culmination of a meritocratic Western civilization that defines the human in terms of culture over biology and is indifferent to genetic adaptation beyond the individual level. Chapter break. The Anglo-Saxon genius for genetically maladaptive behavior. Back to main text. If modern science has invalidated the teleological view that there are natural goals, then modern science has invalidated the notion of science or objectivity itself as a natural or self-justified goal. Science fails to provide an inherent justification of itself. While rationality may not be presumed for other goals, the presumed rationality of science would leave it, devoid of self-justification, as the most self-consciously irrational of goals. Since liberal democracy originally asserted presumptions of superior scientific rationality, and these claims have failed to uphold themselves in a strict sense, liberal democracy's claims to scientific objectivity must be found elsewhere. In that case of America, it appears that the Norman destruction of Anglo-Saxon culture after 1066 is directly correlated with the construction of claims for transcultural science. In other words, the repression of the native culture of the Anglo-Saxons was also the repression of sources of subjectivity, i.e. Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. Thwarted Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism produced a net decline of certain kinds of Anglo-Saxon subjectivity and, in modern times, this became reinterpreted as superior objectivity. The Norman destruction of native Anglo-Saxon culture is thus correlated with the American universalistic claim of being beyond particular cultures, an inclination towards belief in the equality of all cultures. and the claim of the scientific superiority of liberal democracy relative to pre-scientific cultures. A crucial element of the Norman victory in 1066 was the repression of the Anglo-Saxons as a distinct race, ethnicity, or Volk. Native Anglo-Saxon culture was crushed before it had the chance to produce its own Johann Gottfried Herder. This collective culture capitulation was an aspect of Norman mastery that Anglo-Saxons never fully overcame. Conquest was a literal repression of biological factors in the sense of overcoming native values of political ethnic autonomy and self-preservation. It was not only the political destruction of a distinct Anglo-Saxon kin culture, but the destruction of the values of a living faith in that native kin culture. This was almost inevitable since this was virtually the definition of the victory of the Norman inclusive fitness strategy that Eleanor Searle described as predatory kinship. Norman political success was contingent upon, and founded upon, Anglo-Saxon political failure. The maintenance of the English caste system began in Norman preservation of their kin caste, succeeding exactly where the Anglo-Saxons failed. That class institution originated in the will to conserve and perpetuate the Norman victory on October 14, 1066 across the generations by preserving themselves as a caste over the Anglo-Saxons. Without end. The verdict of Hastings was never completely undone. Norman devaluation of Anglo-Saxon ethnic self-preservation was permanently internalized in modern democratic civilization. Individualism, for example, is partly an expression of the failure to fully heal from the conquest. Individualism gave an alternative moral self-interpretation from which Anglo-Saxon prides could be remoralized and rehabilitated. One by one, liberation of the abstract individual emerged through the repression of this conquered Anglo-Saxon past. From this originary condition spawned two interrelated developments: repression and devaluation of kinship biological values, and its inverse, equal individualism. These two developments are really two sides of the same coin. The progress of equality is a continuation of the individualistic solution to the problems of kinship racial biological interpretation. Mass individualism is the monkey wrench in the gene machine that, step by step, inverts the logic of genetically adaptive behavior. In the 20th century, the universalistic pretensions of liberal democracy received its greatest political philosophical challenge from the ethnic cousins of the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans. Just how incompatible these cognate cultures became is empirically evident if we measure the success of each people from the standpoint of genetically adaptive behavior. In general, they went in opposite directions. German Nazism strived to promote genetically adaptive behavior, while the egalitarian progress of liberal democracy exhibited the Anglo-Saxon genius for genetically maladaptive behavior. Anglo-Saxons and Germans are converse cognates emergent from nearly identical ethnic origins. They ultimately ventured towards completely opposite political-cultural directions. The root of this divergence is the Norman conquest. The Nazi kin-selective strategy that led to the attempt to conquer the entire world was very similar to the kin-selective strategy that underlay the Norman conquest, and its historical culmination as the British Empire. The Anglo-Saxon experience of being conquered led to democratic revolutions that effectually rejected the maximal kin-selective strategy of the Normans in principle. English-speaking egalitarian progress is the progress of this reaction to the Norman nepotistic class system, and thus amounts to a kin-unselective strategy and genetically maladaptive behavior. The Norman conquest lies at the root of different cultural attitudes between Anglo-Saxons and Germans on the nature-nurture question. The French language and culture that the Normans brought with them transformed the evolution of English language and culture. The influence of French civilization ultimately engendered a more arbitrary relation between genes and culture. The Germans, on the other hand, never experienced such a profoundly uprooting rupture with their prehistoric language and culture. There is no qualitative equivalent of Heidegger in the English-speaking world, and his contention that language is the house of being, and the genetic cultural intimacy that implies the un-German universalism of American liberal democracy, and the assumption that nature is more palpably distinct from nurture, is largely traceable to the cultural rupture inflicted by the Norman conquest. John Locke's tabula rasa was a historical corollary of his liberal political principles. Lockean nurturism emerged under circumstances where the political analog to the highest level of individual mental organization was not an integrated extension of heredity, but rather the environment of the conquest state tradition. Liberal alienation from the political, in turn, correlated with rationalizing and objectifying the political, while the sub-political, democratic body became the ethnocenter of subjectivity. The German difference is manifest in the philosopher Hegel, whose alien conception of liberal democracy is partly attributable to subject-object synthesis on the political level. The German difference is also evident in Heidegger, whose thinking precedes the Western subject-object distinction, and thus precluding the attempt of some to separate Heidegger's thought from his life. A long-term result of the Norman conquest was opposite attitudes towards government among Anglo-Saxons and Germans. This implicated opposite valuations of rights and duties, and opposite prejudices towards the significance of race. The connections that Germans have tended to make between the biological and the political are often precisely the kinds of connections that Anglo-Saxons have tried to extricate themselves. The German tendency leads to an association of the self with a larger political whole, while the Anglo-Saxon tendency leads to a disassociation of the self from a larger political whole. The German inclination leads to synthetic collectivism, while the Anglo-Saxon inclination leads to analytic individualism. German mental associations emphasize the probabilistic tendencies of human groups, including themselves, with tendencies towards racism. Anglo-Saxon mental disassociations emphasize the possibilities of the individual, with tendencies that inhibit racism. The probabilistic mentality correlates with the entanglement of the observer and larger world of the observed, i.e. the uncertainty principle of German physicist Werner Heisenberg. The possibilistic mentality correlates with a more consistent separation of observer and observed, i.e. the physics of Newton and Einstein. The Anglo-Saxon disassociative tendency promoted a kind of objectivity, Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity, inversely proportional to a kind of objectivity hindered by the disassociative tendency. Specifically, the Anglo-Saxon disassociation of biology and sociology was promoted in proportion to a decrease in socio-biological intelligence. Conversely, the German way of stupidity is to overlook genuine individual exceptions in favor of the probabilistic tendencies of groups. The native English cause at Hastings could be viewed as an implicit struggle for Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. Defeat at Hastings was the defeat of Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism through the defeat of the Anglo-Saxon culture that embodied it. With the reduction of Anglo-Saxon culture, subjective aspects of Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism were reduced. The Anglo-Saxon kind of objectivity gained from this reduction in ethnocentrism is domestic objectivity towards the political. Yet Anglo-Saxon reduction to individuals did not destroy ethnocentrism, it only transformed it. Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism survived individualism in the form of imposing individualism upon people such as the Germans. In other words, socio-biological breakdown into individualism was imposed upon a German culture that had not yet broken down into atomistic individualism. If values cannot be determined by science in itself, then the scientific proclivities of liberal democracy cannot be explained by only pure Enlightenment scientific inquiry in itself. Disinterested scientific objectivity could be used, however, as a weapon in an ethnic kinship struggle. Anglo-Saxons could value scientific objectivity over the subjective, nepotistic self-preservation strategies of the conqueror class to disarm Norman belief in kin-selective values, just as the conquest itself had disarmed Anglo-Saxons of belief in the value of their own ethnicity. The persistent incompatibility of internal political subjectivities advanced internal political objectivity and the principle of freedom of speech. The more objective one is, the more one sees the groundlessness of teleological claims, and the groundlessness of any value claims. The Norman impact left many Anglo-Saxons with a kind of political nihilism, and this is really the condition of a fully rationalistic approach to politics. Ethnic hostility toward the political class evolved into political skepticism and liberal rationalism. The cause of rationalism and free inquiry converged with Anglo-Saxon ethnocentric interest. Combined with the new interpretation of the individual, it superficially appeared as if the dawn of reason itself spawned modern revolution. What was deadly truth from a Nietzschean point of view was the will to kill the Normans. From an Anglo-Saxon point of view, objectivity towards government in the English-speaking world, then, has its origin in an adapted objectification of the enemy in war, a muted continuation of the Battle of Hastings that advanced Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism by advancing the death of the aristocratic Norman enemy. The Anglo-Saxons were able to rationalize the political level more objectively because the political dimension of their identity as a socio-biological body had been attenuated to the point of being dead. The Western difference between ancient political philosophy and modern political sciences, in part, traceable to Anglo-Saxon political death, the overcoming of political subjectivity that allowed for modernistic political objectivity. This correlation of objectivity and death is central, and not peripheral, to understanding the evolution of scientific objectivity towards politics in the English-speaking world. Anglo-Saxon political objectivity as individuals was gained through the death of a larger hive-like socio-biological order on the political level. Anglo-Saxon socio-biological death on the political level was the condition of their modern political rational nihilism, a subjective blind spot that represses explanation of modern political objectivity's origins in ethnic Norman Saxon conflict is the basic source of liberal democracy's original claims to universal rationality and objectivity. It was the Norman conquest that killed genetically adaptive expressions of national collective life that survived among the Germans and culminated in Nazism. Liberal democratic indifference to race and other biologically based factors is built upon a formalization of Anglo-Saxon socio-biological death. This means, in effect, indifference to whether society is organized for genetically adaptive behaviors or genetically maladaptive behaviors, and this means indifference to biological evolution. Not surprisingly, modern indifference to biological factors is correlated with an increase in genetically maladaptive behaviors. The egalitarian progress that began as compromised Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism led to working out the implications of Anglo-Saxon internalization of their ethnic defeat. Modern freedom implies freedom from the genes, freedom from slavery to instincts such as the fear of death, freedom from the prejudices towards existence, freedom from life. A full realization of this freedom could be rational biological self-destruction. To will to death is the highest freedom from the tyranny of the most common instinct, the will to survive. To realize full freedom from biology, let go of your prejudice towards life. Socio-biological death is expressed, for example, through the dissolving of socio-biological borders between ethnic nations. The next step of progress is to dissolve the kinship borders between individuals, i.e. human rights. Ultimately, all borders between the biological and general physical world are implicated, and these borders can only be overcome in individual death. In this way, the death of kin-selective socio-biological boundaries ultimately implicates the death of life-preserving boundaries between an individual and the larger physical world. Bring down the political hierarchies of the world ultimately implicates bringing down the hierarchies of one's own mind. The conviction that life is superior to death is a prejudice in the tradition of prejudice on the basis of race or sex difference. However, when you open your mind to death in larger historical perspective, it becomes clear that death is not a novel expression of modern egalitarianism. On the contrary, death, especially the death of Anglo-Saxon England in 1066, stands at the very origins of the world's most influential egalitarian tradition. Life's equality with death is only a fulfillment of its founding. The kind of free inquiry formally permitted in American liberal democracy is founded upon the socio-biological carcass of the Saxon nation. Political scientific reductionism originated in the reduction of Anglo-Saxons to a sub-political body after 1066. politics. The most influential modern democratic tradition originated in Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism as opposition to Norman conquerors. The modern life of free individualism was founded upon the political kin-selective death of Anglo-Saxons at the hands of their Norman masters. What, then, were the socio-biological origins of socio-biological controversy ignited by E. O. Wilson's great work of 1975? The very condition of his freedom to pursue rational inquiry was founded upon the socio-biological death of the Anglo-Saxons as a kin-selective body. Wilson woke the dead. In summary, if scientific objectivity has no fundamental rational self-justification, then its origins must lie in something other than pure objectivity. It appears that the Norman conquest, by reducing Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism, helped to increase a proclivity towards materialist objectivity. This objectivity was ultimately turned against the Normans themselves in the form of democratic objectivity towards politics. In this way, the original goal of liberal democratic objectivity in the English-speaking world was Anglo-Saxon ethnocentricity. Yet if science is not ultimately self-justified, then how do I explain my own claims to objectivity? The ethnic origins of the American state have seemingly been lost in the ethnic chaos of the United States. Seemingly random relations among individuals act as noise that encrypts the genealogical path source of individualism's origins. It takes the mind of detective to decrypt that path source, for it is of the very nature of egalitarian ideologies to erase hereditary traces of its origins. It is, finally, like a detective, after following out this genealogical trail against the noise of hereditary chaos, against the patterns designed to disguise patterns, and the cultural smokescreens that distract and elude, that I am inevitably led to myself.